Thank you very much, Deputy Secretary General Majunda. Thank you very much, Narendra Sabharwal, an old friend and colleague. It's a pleasure to see you here. Ladies and gentlemen and friends, it's really a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. FICCI and WIPO have a long-standing relationship, and we're very proud of that, and cooperation dating back many, many years, as long as I can remember, actually. So we are absolutely delighted with that cooperation, and I'm delighted to be here this afternoon with my colleagues Naresh Prasad, Assistant Director General, and Samar Shamoon, who's the head of our media relations. I would also, at the outset, like to express our appreciation to the Government of India for all of the support that it gives to multilateralism, first of all, and to the World Intellectual Property Organization, secondly. As you are all aware, these are days when multilateralism is challenged. It does not have a huge number of friends necessarily, and it's wonderful to receive the constantly constructive support of India for the World Intellectual Property Organization and for multilateral cooperation, international cooperation in the field of intellectual property. Well, now, let me turn to the subject. As Rajiv Agarwal has said, this is quite a large subject, and I'm not quite sure I know what the Fourth Industrial Revolution means. But of course, as originally articulated by the German government, actually, and by it was the cyber-physical connection that they emphasized, and particularly in Industry 4.0, as they said, and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Of course, since that time, I think we've all used the term in a rather indiscriminate manner, and it's come to cover quite a lot of different phenomena. In particular, I would say the underlying digital revolution that has been occurring really over the course of the last 50 years, if one looks at it in a larger perspective. So what I would like to do in that context, given that, is to make just initially a couple of comments about the situation of intellectual property internationally, generally, and then move to some more specific comments which seek to address really the new environment that we are seeing under this banner of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Well, now, generally, in the field of intellectual property internationally, I would say there are, in the course of looking back across the last 20 years or so, we see three persistent trends that have been occurring in the field of intellectual property. The first of those is that we have experienced demand for intellectual property rights that has vastly exceeded the performance of the world economy. Let me say that in other terms. The rate of increase in demand for intellectual property has been more or less twice the rate of increase in the world economy. So it's a small measure, if you like, of the knowledge economy. We are seeing this sector performing much better than all other sectors. And this sector, of course, is a very large sector. We're talking about a horizontal phenomenon. But the volumes are quite extraordinary now. In the last full year for which we have statistics from our member states, about 3.1 million patent applications worldwide. This is 2016. 3.1 million patent applications worldwide, 9.8 million trademark applications worldwide, 1.2 million design applications worldwide. So these are really prodigious numbers, extraordinary numbers, and something, rates of increase in the course of the last 20 years which are quite extraordinary, hundreds of %. Second thing I think that we see as a persistent trend is that the geography of intellectual property has completely changed also in the course of the last 20 years. So much of that growth that I've just mentioned has come from Asia and from China in particular. So we now see a completely different geography for intellectual property. And let's take just international patent applications as one example. If you were to go back to the middle of the 1990s, about 20 years ago, Asia was the source of about 7.6% of international patent applications filed under the Patent Cooperation Treaty. Last year it was 49.1%. So this is an incredible transformation, again, in the course of the last 20 years. And of course, it's consistent with demographic trends, it's consistent with trends in economic production, and with all other indicators in the field of science and technology, such as the number of scientific, medical, and technical and medical publications that have been published. So these are two things that we've seen, and the third, I would say, persistent trend that we're seeing is the increased complexity that we see in intellectual property, and I think that applies on two levels. First, the complexity of the architecture. Again, going back maybe 25 years now, you had really only activity in intellectual property at the national level and at the international level at WIPO alone. Then, of course, we know, or now we see that there are very active agendas at the national level, as for example in India. There are very active agendas bilaterally. There is not a bilateral trade or economic relationship that is concluded that does not address the subject of intellectual property. Very active plurilaterally, in various groupings, whether RCEP or other different groupings, plurilateral groupings. Very active regionally and at the multilateral level, not just WIPO, but also WTO, and other organizations such as the World Health Organization, all interested in intellectual property. So a great complexity in the architecture, and one of the questions that arises out of all that is, who is keeping the coherence in all this? You know, what is the coherence of all of these different obligations and the levels of obligations? And that's a very good question. The complexity also that we see applies to the substance as well, with much more complexity in the questions relating to intellectual property protection that we now see in many, many areas. And that brings us, of course, to the phenomenon of the fourth industrial revolution, or the intensification of, I would say, innovation and the dominance of technology as a factor in our economy. That, at its broadest, I think, is what we are talking about. And the trends that I've mentioned are expressions of that intensification of innovation and innovative activity and the dominance of technology in the economy. But it's beyond that, and let me make, I'd say, 1, 2, 3, 4 points if I've got the time, because it would be good to have some discussion. And so I don't want to speak for too long. But let me make about 4 points relating to it. First point I would say is that science, technology, and innovation policy are dominant policy priorities in most countries of the world now. And I think this is a change. So if you look at the largest economies in the world, it's certainly the case for the United States of America. It's certainly the case for China. President Xi Jinping has laid this out very clearly, and his predecessors did as well. It's certainly the case for Japan, the third largest economy. It's certainly the case for Germany, you know, the fourth largest economy, and it's certainly the case for the United Kingdom. It's certainly the case for India. It's certainly the case for France. You just go on down the line, and every single country has as a central element of its economic strategy innovation and technology in particular, but science, technology, and innovation. I think that what this means, when you add it up with the preceding trends to which I referred, is that competition is first of all multipolar now. So the changed geography means that we have a much more complex basis of competition in science, technology and innovation, and the competition is fierce. It is extremely tough competition out there. So that would be, I think, my first comment about the new environment. A second comment, I think, which relates really to, again, the trend to see an intensification of interest in intellectual property, is that the volume of applications that we see now, and this is, I'll make as a parenthesis because I know intellectual property administration is not perhaps your main focus, but the volume of applications that we see now, and the figures I gave you, we will publish new figures in about 2 weeks' time, same trend. Same increases of 8, 9, 10, 11%. That volume is driving, I think, the application of artificial intelligence to intellectual property administration. So we will see more and more examples of artificial intelligence being applied to the administration of intellectual property. Just let's consider one element of that, if we may, just to illustrate it. The figurative element of a trademark, let's say the Mercedes symbol, or a design. Well, on 9.8 million trademark applications worldwide, looking at the comparison of the figurative elements with past applications and the current applications in a year, it's becoming impossible for a human being to do this. So the volumes are driving the application of artificial intelligence. A third comment then, if I may, is that I think we are all being called upon to question the fitness for purpose of the current intellectual property system to the new circumstances of innovation and technology in the economy. Now, there is, of course, a school of thought which would say that intellectual property is a creature of the Industrial Revolution, and that the categories that it uses no longer conform to the categories of the sort of innovative activity that we see occurring in the contemporary economy. Now, as to that view, I think the first thing that I would say is that it's counter-empirical, because the rate of increase in the number of applications that we're seeing is not saying that intellectual property is becoming obsolete. On the contrary, it's saying that intellectual property is valued for one reason or another more and more by industry around the world. So the existing system, I think, of intellectual property has far from outgrown its utility. And that's what the statistics are telling us. However, it's quite possible that it doesn't cover all of the sort of innovative activity that is going on in the new economy. And it's quite possible, therefore, that we might see the emergence of new forms of intellectual property protection or intellectual property rights, which instead of being a substitution for the old intellectual property rights might constitute an additional layer or additional rights. So what are some examples of this? Well, I think if you look at the life sciences as one example, and they all revolve around IT and data. If you look at the life sciences, for example, you see that computational biology is generating huge volumes of data, which are important, but they in no way correspond to an invention in the terms of the patent system. They're not something that is new, that involves an inventive step and that is industrially applicable or useful. They are rather valuable volumes of data with a future potential which is as yet unascertained, but that doesn't detract from their value. So it leads, I think, to the question of what is the status of data legally within this new innovation economy, which is very much based upon data? Excuse me. I don't think anyone has any answer for that at the moment. And it's a major, major question. And I think we are only in general starting to define the various approaches, policy approaches to data, which include security of data, which is not an IP question, of course, but it includes the security of data. It includes the integrity of data, the fake news problem. It includes questions of taxation and location of data. It includes questions, thank you very much, questions of privacy, of protection of personal data. It includes questions of competition law, and it includes questions of ownership and property. And there I think we do need to put our heads together and to start to think about how we approach these categories of data outside the classical industrial revolution system of intellectual property, but which are so very important to modern or contemporary innovation activity and models. And I think there we see that at least one of the great lines of discussion in society is between openness and closedness in relation to data. So many in the scientific community support open models of data and sharing of data. But there are certain policy imperatives which would suggest closure at a certain moment. One of those is privacy and personal data protection. So this, I think, will be a big fault line, the difference between openness and closure in relation to data. Now, briefly, one perhaps other comment that I might make about the new environment is that amongst the many challenges that it throws up for us all to think about, one of the challenges is a fundamental challenge of governance. And so what we are seeing is that a bit paradoxically, more and more of the questions that are arising are inherently international in nature. And this applies probably to all fields, but it applies also to science, technology, and innovation. They're inherently international questions. However, the capacity of the international community to be able to solve those questions has perhaps never been lower than it is at the present time. It's very difficult for the international community to agree upon the time of day. But many of these questions relating to data, sooner or later, are going to have an international or a multilateral approach. Without it, we are in the current situation where, just as an example and not a criticism, you see that the first mover, speaking from a regulatory point of view, provided that it has the scale, really makes the world law. So I would suggest that this is the case for the GDPR, which is the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. So the size of the European market is so large that no company operating internationally can afford not to comply with the GDPR. And compliance, since it concerns data and IT systems, means that you're going to set all of your systems for compliance, because you're not going to have separate, different IT systems configured for the world. That's, as I said, not a criticism, it's just an observation. But the European Union has moved first perhaps in that area, but others will move first in other areas, and that will be China, and that will be India, and that will be the United States of America, and so on. So, sooner or later, we are going to have to confront this fact that this is an international environment which is produced by the data and digital economy and revolution, and it is going to require some attention from governance models and cooperation what that cooperation will be is it's probably going to be very different from the classical cooperation that we've seen internationally in the past. So let me finish at that point, and thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you this afternoon.